I'm here today with Steven Brill, author of the book Tailspin, and our friend Dennis Kelleher from Better Markets. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Steven, you've written a book at a time when people feel a disintegration of trust and legitimacy in society. You talk about meritocracy, you talk about exploitation of what you call moats, you talk about the divisions between certain segments of society, and you also talk about a hopefulness that you can see people like Dennis Kelleher resisting these tendencies. When you begin the book, as I recall, you're talking a little bit about what John Kennedy could say, and later what people like Clintons and Bush and Obama could say, and it was a much less vital or inspiring agenda.
Well,
what happened?
Well, the book, as I point out, in the age of Kennedy and the New Frontier, or if you're a Republican, the age of Dwight Eisenhower before him, the country was investing. The country was looking forward. The country was seizing the future. It's now probably fair to say that most of the people in this country, basically feel like they just need to hang on. That the future is not better than the present, and the present is not better than the past. And that's not nostalgia. It's real when it comes to the core middle-class dream in this country that my kids are going to be better off than I was. That is not happening. Those are just facts. That is not happening for the majority of people in this country. And the book basically traces a lot of different reasons that it's not happening. And the overarching theme really is that it's through a series of unintended consequences or consequences that we didn't realize we were going to have at the time. Such as, for example, a lawsuit that Ralph Nader brought in 1976, where he won the right of discount drugstores to advertise that they were discounting their prices. And his theory was that the First Amendment benefited listeners as much as it benefited the speakers, if not more so. So I have a right to know that I can buy drugs at a discount. The Supreme Court agreed with him and said that it's not right to discriminate on the basis of who the speaker is, and that just because the speaker is a corporation, they should be allowed to speak if they're contributing to the public dialogue. In this case, the dialogue about the price of drugs. That sounds like a great thing until it morphs into the Citizens United decision in 2010. And there are a whole series of events in the book, beginning in the late 1960s and 70s, like that, where our core values, in this case the First Amendment, in other cases due process, in other cases meritocracy, become something other than what we intended.
So they cease to be protections, they become channels of exploitation.
Well, they become protections for the haves. Indeed, they become, as you put it, moats for the haves, but they become a threat to everybody else.
You talked in the book about how people in the 60s and others thought Washington was working. The broadening of prosperity was a shared agenda, and they were trying to facilitate that. More recently, I say a 2016 election and so forth, people see Washington as broken. They don't have any trust.
Right. Now, to put that in perspective, the polling in the 1960s was that 80% of the people in this country thought that their officials in Washington were working for them. Mm-hmm. And now it's the opposite. It's like, 15 or 20%. Having said that, if you had polled African Americans and probably a lot of women, they would not have said that Washington was working for them. So we do need to put that in perspective. But on the whole, there was confidence in government, and rightly so, because government hadn't been captured by all the people who had the money to buy government. And the consequence of the Ralph Nader lawsuit and the consequence of other events is that we have monetized our democracy in a way that that the Founding Fathers could not have imagined. There's a scene in the book where I spend an afternoon with a member of Congress who is sitting in a windowless room about a block from the Capitol, and he is sitting there dialing for dollars for 5 hours, and he does that every weekday. And at night, he goes to cocktail parties that lobbyists have arranged so that they can introduce their clients to him, and lobbyists, raise the money and give him the checks at those cocktail parties. This is a very good guy. He went into public service for all the reasons that we want people to go into public service, and he has become a half-time or more than half-time money raiser. And he's typical. I didn't pick him out because he's atypical. Most members of Congress have to do that 5 days a week, every week of the year, because they have to raise that much money.
In the United States Senate, and one of my two bosses, who was in the Republican Party, said that he thought the average senator spent 70% of his time on fundraising.
Yeah, now that is a real problem, because it's the result is most of the people you talk to, even if you're a really terrific person, most of the people you talk to are not the typical Americans, because by definition they have the money to give to political campaigns. And now, with no limits on what people can contribute to campaigns, because they can contribute to PACs, they're typically very wealthy people. So that causes a polarization in our politics, because you run in a primary and your principal worry is that someone is going to be funded who's further to the right of you if you're a Republican, or further to the left of you if you're a Democrat. And that is part of what has paralyzed our country. It's why we haven't had a comprehensive budget voted out of Congress since 1994. It's why we haven't been able to raise the gas tax since 1993, which used to be, as American as apple pie, totally uncontroversial. The gas tax had to go up because we had to maintain our highways, and the miles per gallon that you got from a gallon of gas went up, which means that you had to raise the tax in order just to keep it from going down.
You talk about the notion of meritocracy, and what you might call idealized view is that when somebody gets an education, they're becoming more aware, more sensitive, more able in pattern recognition, so that at least some can become public leaders and be a steward for society, to guide or navigate from a leadership position.
Well, that's certainly your ideal, and it's the ideal that's painted on the wall out here, I may notice, but that's not the ideal that has taken hold in this country. What happened is, the good news is that the country became much more of a meritocracy in the 1960s and 70s. It's certainly good news for me. That's how I got a scholarship to Yale. But around that notion of meritocracy was packed in notion that, well, merit is how well did you do on your college boards, or what was the quality of the high school you were coming from. So the result of that is now the next generation, their parents, who were winners in the meritocracy, can pay for them to get all kinds of tutoring for college boards, can pay for them to go to private schools. They can even send them for a summer internship, building houses in Nicaragua, which will dress up their resumes. So the notion of meritocracy sounds great, but is that really real? It creates a much more defensible narrative, which is to say, I'm rich because I worked hard and I did well on my exams, and I did well in college, and I did well in law school, and I became a partner at a law firm. I did it on the merits. I was not born to it.
When you talk about, let's say those left behind and those who've got elite degrees, my romantic notion of meritocracy was you become more sensitive and therefore more able to lead. But if you're using these degrees as justification, as a narrative, it allows you to become more insensitive to the people you're supposed to be representing.
That's exactly right. Now, I have a slightly different take on that, or at least a different version of the same story, which is to say that the whole history of any country, or of any society for that matter, that works well, especially a capitalist marketplace, is you always figure out some balance, and you're always debating the balance, but you figure out the balance between your personal achievement and what you provide for your family and yourself and the common good. And the way a society does that is that they build in all kinds of guardrails. You can't violate antitrust laws. You know, it's good to try to make a lot of money if you own a business, but you can't violate antitrust laws. You have to have a labor law regime that has, you know, some kind of a level playing field. You can't just, you know, exploit your workers. You got to pay a minimum wage. The minimum wage ought to be decent. You know, those are the essential guardrails that we've always established. And what happened is that the people who rose in the meritocracy were so smart and so much more driven and tougher than people who used to rise up because they had the connections. You know, these are tougher, smarter people. You know, my law school classmates were, you know, tougher and, you know, much more able than the people who went to Yale Law School a generation before, because they did it without any connections. That's good, except when they get to law firms, they are also tougher and smarter and much more able to defend the kinds of clients that can afford to pay those law firms. And very few of them sort of look around like this guy did and say, well, you know, I need to help restore the balance. They don't get paid to restore the balance. They don't get incented to restore the balance. The country doesn't even, you know, give them any psychic credit for trying to restore the balance. So we've become this country of, you know, hard-driven, you know, people who strive to do the best they can. If they get to an investment bank, they will invent, you know, the most complicated kind of instruments that may put the country at risk, but will make them a lot of money very quickly. And they're not breaking the law. They're not evil people. They don't wake up in the morning and say, gee, I wonder how I can screw the country so that my family can have more money. But that is the result, the slow-moving result over the 50 years of the tailspin. That is the result of what, you know, that's what happened.
It's the dismantling of the guardrails that would heighten their consciousness. To
The
approaching
guardrails
the
are
boundaries.
meant to be the balance, again, between individual achievement and the common good. And we've lost sight of the common good. And then worst of all is that people who are irresponsible and violate the common good, you know, such as the people who caused the crash of 2007, 2008, they're not held responsible.
Yeah.
So, you know, the best kind of guardrail is if you do something bad that violates the common good, we're going to hold you responsible. And not a single executive responsible for the crash was held accountable for it.
Yes. Dennis Kelleher plays a role in your book. There's a very nice discussion about his organization, Better Markets. One of the things I found most inspiring about your book is it wasn't as if you were looking back and saying, how did we turn the corner and get back on track? But you showed the signs of what it would look like to get back on track with tangible examples like
Which was
this.
almost by accident, I have to tell you, because the reason I first started talking to guys like him and, you know, people, you know, working for campaign finance reform or for bipartisan, you know, policy making, was I wanted to gather as much information as I could about how bad things were. And then I realized, you know, the more I talked to Dennis and other people like that, okay, so they're giving me all this information about how things are terrible, but they're coming to work every morning and trying to think of ways to turn it around. And my first reaction as a cynical journalist is, you know, you crazy? Why are you wasting your time doing this? I mean, you know,
I think that was the exact question, yes.
You know, every event around you is galloping in the opposite direction. This guy just got elected president who's going to dismantle Dodd-Frank, and you don't even like the Dodd-Frank that got passed.
Right.
You know, why are you doing this? And then I realized that they're part of the story. They're a big part of the story, because if the country is going to be resilient, it needs resilient people doing that in the face of seemingly ridiculous odds. And he's there. There are lots of organizations in you know, different spheres that are there and doing the same thing. And the theory of my case is that when the country gets so disgusted with the way they've been scammed, with the way, in their frustration, they turned to a guy who was the antithesis of the meritocracy, right? A guy who's born rich, he shoots from the hip, he never prepares, bankrupted 6 times. They turn to this guy who promises, I'll get the coal mining jobs back, I'll build a wonderful infrastructure, I'll lower your taxes, you'll have the best health care in the world.
I'll drain the swamp.
I'll drain the swamp. When they realize that they've been scammed, just the way the students of the Trump University were scammed, they're going to turn, and when they turn, they will turn to leaders who are able to tap into their frustration and channel it into unity between the frustrated middle class and the frustrated poor. And when that happens, people who are doing the kind of work that Dennis is doing will have the blueprints and presumably the following and the troops to really start to put things back the other way.
Naomi Klein wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, which was about how the haves and the powerful wait for a crisis that could never be democratically implemented, and they come with their blueprints into that crisis. When I read that part of your book, and you talked about him, instead of being a heckler, moving to the center at Better Markets, I thought of that passage from Naomi Klein's book, where you come with the blueprints where when we have to restore faith and trust, you're ready, you're prepared.
Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner had a famous line where at the time we were trying to figure out of the rubble and the ashes, what do you do for the financial system? The line was attributed to him, that he said, plan beats no plan. And the problem was the financial industry had a plan for how to deal with it, and there was no plan on the other side. I mean, one of the goals of Better Markets, and similarly for the other organizations in the book, is that next time there'll be a plan. And there'll be a more robust plan and a more compelling plan. And most importantly, it's a plan that will actually serve the broad American public and what you call unprotected. I mean, it's quite remarkable. It's not only, as Steve talked about, but this decoupling of the protected few versus the many. And the decoupling has them essentially disregarding the commons, the public interest and the commons in a way, where they go from private gated communities to private cars to private elevators to private offices to private homes to private helicopters. And even the visibility of what's happening in America. And I thought one of the great things about and I think it's a brilliant book in many ways. I mean, it's a panoramic view. I mean, in a country where the attention span is 30 to 60 seconds, it takes you back so you actually really understand in a nuanced way with great storytelling that only a journalist could do, actually. But it shows how this decoupling has happened in a way that you would think a meritocracy would not, because if you pulled yourself up from the bootstraps, you would think you would remember where you came from. And in fact, what happens is this mindset—
You don't have any reminders.
Well, you don't see anybody, and you also have this arrogance born from, well, I did this all by myself.
Yeah.
And
much
yet,
better narrative.
Right, it's a much better self-justification to ignore the commons. But in fact, if you look at what happened in the sweep of history, they have as much at stake as everybody else in the country. And so what they are doing, in effect, while protecting themselves, building their moats, paying their army of lawyers and lobbyists to bend Washington to their will, is they're actually undermining the very foundation of their wealth and their status and their position.
The key is that they're short-term thinkers.
Right.
And people, they only think about the short term, and in the short term, they're doing well. And they not only don't they need government the way the rest of us do. I mean, we need to have nice airports. They don't fly in and out of our airports. We need mass transit. We need good K to 12 schools. They can go to private schools. We need decent health insurance. They don't worry about the cost of that stuff. But not only don't they need government, but government is typically a threat to them. It takes away their winnings if they enforce antitrust laws or labor laws or job safety laws or have a fair tax code. They're the victims of good government. And the story I tell in the book is the story of what happened to jury duty in New York State. Until the mid-1990s, just about anybody who was anyone could get an exemption from jury duty. All lawyers could, doctors could. If you were a businessman, you'd write a letter saying, have a really important board meeting next week. I'm sorry, I can't come. Everybody got an exemption who wanted one. In the mid-1990s, the chief judge decided to reform the jury duty system, and all exemptions were eliminated, including lawyers. Before those reforms, when you went for jury duty, it was this dingy room, and the clerks were nasty, and it was dirty and disgusting, and they'd tell you to come in even though they knew a week before that they weren't going to need you. They just didn't care. It was just lousy. When they reformed it and took away the exemptions, within 6 months, the chief judge told me that she started going to bar association meetings and dinners, and lawyers would come up to her and complain about the clerks are rude, the room is disgusting, it's awful, you've got to fix the jury duty system. And guess what? It got fixed because everybody relied on the jury duty system working, even people with power. There's almost nothing in the United States where people with a lot of power and a lot of money rely on the government. You need to get your passport renewed, well, you can hire an expediter for that. You can fly, privately. Nobody gets drafted, so, the war is for people, who are poor and middle class, who are lured into enlisting. So there's no sense that everybody's in this together and needs for the government to function. These people, don't worry if they call the Social Security Administration about, a lost claim, and it takes 10 hours, literally 10 hours on hold to get someone on the phone, and then you're told to call back. They don't worry about that.
Yep.
But a lot of other people do. So that's what's happened in this country.
You talked about everybody in this together or not. And I will tell you myself, in reading this book at the instigation of Dennis, I already knew the good work that you were doing, but seeing through the things you pulled together, that there are a lot of people that can make you believe we are in this together.
Yeah.
And we don't have to stay down in the ditch. And I will tell you, Stephen, people on my staff looked at this book over the last couple of weeks, and they come up and say, this is great, this is great. So
nice
there's
to hear.
something that you've created that's very encouraging,
hope
and
so.
I'm grateful to you for writing not only about the disintegration and explaining why and explaining what's wrong and what's gotten off course, but also seeing more of the goodness that's actually the potential that's out there.
More of the crazy people who still come to work trying to fix things and realizing that they're not so crazy.
We think of it as optimism.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It's tough.
thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Pleasure
Thanks,
to meet
Rob.
you.
Thanks for
Nice
having me.
seeing you.